Hi everyone, my name is Jay. I work at the ARC of King County as the Information and Referral Program Manager. I use she, her pronoun. I am wearing a shirt and have long black hair. Behind of me is a virtual background of a pink room. Thank you for joining us for an engaging talk on executive functioning, what it is, why it matters, and how we can support students in building these essential life skills. Thank you for joining us for an engaging talk on executive functioning, what it is, why it matters, and how we can support students in building these essential life skills. Throughout today's session, we'll explore the core components of executive functioning, which include skills such as working memory, cognitive flexibility, and self-control. These skills are critical not only for academic success, but for navigating life's challenges in general. Kashif, do you want to take it over?
Happy to. Thanks, Jay, for that introduction, and happy to get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, typically, this talk is attended by students as well as families of neurodivergent teens, from eighth grade anywhere to sort of early in career, if you will. So, high school, college, and early in career professionals. Typically, these students are on an IEP or a 504 plan, may or may not be diagnosed though. So, either way, it's relevant to, I hope, a very broad set of audience. I just kind of want to always ground things first in terms of, who this talk is sort of catered toward. So, I do want to take a step back and kind of ground us a little bit further in our own journey. Like, why do I do this? Why do I give these talks and so on and so forth? And it's very personal. I'm a parent. My wife and I are both parents of two neurodivergent teens ourselves. Our son's on the autism spectrum. Our daughter's ADD. They both have anxiety. And they've both kind of gone through the IEP process. They've gone through the 504 plan process in the school district. And then over the course of time, what we noticed was as sort of the academic and life demands increased in the rigor, the supports have been kind of decreasing. And of course, some of that is by design, right? Because we want all our students to be independent. But at the same time, a lot of it is also sort of just seems like, ill-timed, poorly planned or under-resourced, of course, from a special education in schools perspective or whatever. The other thing that I have noticed is that for students who have sort of like this invisible profile when it comes to their disabilities, it's very easy to sort of ignore or sort of hand wave past. Like, I mean, we would hear this about our students from time to time that, oh, he seems fine, right? Or she seems to be doing okay. And I've talked to a lot of parents who say the same thing, that listen, it just seems like the system is not set up to kind of go deep and kind of really explore what's going on under the surface. Like if the student is kind of making it through school somehow, the amount of struggle it's taking to make it through school, that remains invisible. And unfortunately, that's happening all the way to the in workplace as well. So, again, for this particular, for our family's reasons, as well as for, for what's kind of happening even in the workplaces later down the road, that's sort of kind of what got me excited about the fact that we should talk more about this. And what I see sort of happening in terms of prioritization of educational resources in the United States, there's a lot of talk about career connected learning, so career readiness and career pathways and so on and so forth, AI literacy, and heck, I mean, I do that a lot, right? I actually develop sort of career pathways and so on using AI literacy and entrepreneurial mindset, etc. But outside academic circles, what I have yet to see is a lot more talk about these durable skills. The skills like executive functioning skills, which we'll talk about today, that kind of carry over across different types of careers and different types of subjects and different domains, right? So I think we can have both, right? And that's kind of why I do what I do, which is to kind of focus on executive function skills coaching. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about what is executive function. Then we'll kind of go deeper into the skill set. We'll talk a little bit about applications and the case studies. And sort of like a quick note up front on that one. These case studies are based mostly, not all, but mostly on my work with my own kids. The reason is very simple. I want to make sure that I impart to you as much detail as possible And of course, I can permit myself to do that. So we'll get kind of like really into the nitties and gritties of what was going on, what did we do, and so on, right? So we'll talk a little bit about these sort of case studies. Another thing you'll notice is that you'll see me kind of go old school in some of these case studies too. So you'll see some whiteboard use, some paper and pen and so on, and which is kind of ironic coming from somebody who spent 20 years in the tech sector and is pretty deep in ed tech. The reason is I really have come to conclude that the human in the loop is just so much more important, or is so much important. Like you can have the best tools ever, but at the end of the day, a lot happens at that sort of interface of interaction between the person and the student, right? Or really the coach or educator and the student that simply gets lost if we only leave it to the confines of the screen. So you'll see some actual screenshots of and photographs and so on. I hope you don't mind, but I hope it's going to be instructive. Okay. So let's start with what is executive function. Newark Airport handles 1,100 flights a day, inbound and outbound, right? And managing it all is an air traffic control that is seriously understaffed and under-equipped and therefore overburdened, which is why we've had so many unfortunate events or near misses throughout this year, just in 2025, and we're about 7 months in. Now, these professionals themselves, they're smart and they're trained, but as a function, though, you have the sort of 25% staff shortage, the ancient equipment, obviously staff constantly taking breaks because they're simply burning out. Now, I don't know about you, but this kind of reminds me of a typical week in the life of my own team, which is a lot of flights up in the air and just kind of trying to manage it all. And that exactly is what executive function does. It's an air traffic control for your brain. And just like real air traffic controls, your executive function also requires skills and the right systems in order for it to not burn out and to remain sustainable so that you're securely and safely in control of your life. Executive function deficits or challenges are common across a wide variety of neurodivergent conditions, from autism as well as ADD and others. And if common sense was not enough, research has shown that that really significantly impairs academic performance for our students. Now, if you ask one of our students, particularly as the semester gets going or as a semester starts in school, that, hey, how are you feeling about all your courses? How are you feeling about your work? A lot of times what you may hear is, we're fine, everything is good, right? Of course, behind the scenes, they may be freaking out already. And then, of course, as the semester kind of gets going and a few weeks in, you get to see a different picture start to emerge kind of behind the scenes. You may have somebody who is barely hanging on, and this is sort of where the disengaged doom scrolling starts to happen. And of course, in some cases, or in many cases, by the end of the semester, it has imploded and pulled the entire family together, and not always in a very good way. So where does this executive function sort of come from? So executive function skills reside in sort of the prefrontal cortex, but what they really do is that prefrontal cortex is actually orchestrating across a variety of other brain functions in the back, or throughout the rest of the brain. And that's kind of what brings about what these executive function skills really are. So that's kind of where EF comes from. And just like other skills, executive function skills are also, they basically progress along your developmental stages of your life, right? So in fact, the Center on Developing Child at Harvard University has put together a study where they have specific strategies and activities that are recommended for developing and practicing EF skills according to developmental stages. So now there's a lot of literature out there on what are executive functioning skills and different categorizations and so on and so forth. Some are really deep, some are too high level to be sort of very useful on a day-to-day basis. The literature that has sort of spoken the most to me, if you will, that resonates the most with me, is Dawson and Richard Guare's work. They have sort of extracted 12 specific skills that don't have a ton of overlap, but together they're sort of comprehensive, right? So a comprehensive toolkit. So we've got the skills up on the screen. Some of these tags are fairly self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go and define all of them one by one. You can, of course, read the book, which I do highly recommend. I'm just going to pick on a couple of these. So response inhibition, for example, I'm presenting to you right now. Ooh, I smell cake being baked outside. Now I'm distracted. That's a simple or silly example, but that's kind of like, inhibiting that response and just kind of keep going, that type of thing. Or, somebody starts to mow the lawn outside and I want to talk, not let that distract me and kind of keep going. Let's see here. Working memory is another interesting one. It's somewhere between short-term and long-term memory. So it's not exactly, a lot of times it gets confused with short-term memory, but it's actually not. It's more than that because it's the memory. It's kind of like the RAM for your computer. It's how you're sort of storing information, but also manipulating it and combining it with something that's in your long-term memory and long-term storage to make things happen. That's kind of what working memory is. Let's see here. Planning and organization. So Dawson and Guare differentiate between the two, and this is really interesting. What I will say is organization, the way they define it, is kind of a sense of readiness, kind of like that "Are you ready?" screen in the beginning of a video game. That "Are you settled?" Or as my dad used to call it, there's a time and place for everything, and everything should be in its time and place. That's what organization roughly means. Planning and prioritization is something else. That's about actually estimating the amount of resources and amount of time required to get anything done and to break it down into well, sequence all the small steps out that are required and knowing what are the small steps and what are the big steps. That's what planning and prioritization is. And then I guess the couple other things that I like to always kind of point out are stress tolerance and metacognition. So stress tolerance is about our capacity to deal with challenges, if you will, or take on difficult work. A classic example of this is, my son was signing up to the Handshake app, which is a career exploration app for Seattle University. It's available across all sorts of university. He happens to be going to SU. And as he was signing up, he had the option to show his preference or reflect his preference for the type of employer that he likes. Either it's a dynamic, fast-paced environment or a supportive, collaborative environment. And he said, "Well, Dad, which one do you think I should pick?" And as you can imagine, knowing his profile, he being on the autism spectrum, being ADD with anxiety, you can imagine what I recommended to him. What's interesting is about that classification is it doesn't say anything about the value of the work. Both of those organizations, whether they're high-paced and fast, dynamic, whatever, or supportive and collaborative and flexible, either way, they're probably doing valuable work. But the path to get there is different, and it fits with your skills differently. And then metacognition is probably one of my favorite ones. It's thinking about thinking. So it's sort of it's kind of like you can have the best plan ever, but how do you know where you are in the plan at any given point of time? So I'm on, whatever, 20 minutes into this conversation, knowing that I've got X amount of time left. Therefore, either I should hurry up or slow down or whatever. That's what metacognition is about. So again, 12 different skills. What Dawson and Guare recommend is that you always start by knowing kind of what your profile for these skills are, right? And of course, every journey kind of starts with knowing kind of where you are at a given point of time. And you can do that in a formal way or an informal way. Formally, you can take an assessment like so. It is called the brief. It has 78 questions, so perhaps not so brief, but a licensed professional can administer this assessment for you. Less formally, there are many other types of assessments available as well. This is Dawson and Guare's own questionnaire for executive functions. And this is something that actually I found fairly useful as a practical matter, particularly if you don't want to part with thousands of dollars for an assessment. Sometimes these sort of informal assessments suffice, and you don't have to see a licensed professional to get guidance for that as well. So either way, know kind of where you are. And from that point onward, just like anything else, it's a matter of managing or working around your weaknesses and playing to your strengths. So for example, between my wife and I am not very good at task initiation, right? But she is. But when it comes to planning, that's a strength of mine and perhaps not hers. So when it comes to household work or projects, if you will, I procrastinate. Whereas she would just go ahead and start and launch into a project. Unfortunately, a lot of times without a plan to kind of finish it. So, but this is kind of where we can complement each other. When the time came for a 4-year financial planning for college, for example, that she deferred to me. And of course, that's something that I thrive on. And to develop these skill sets, for executive function, Dawson and Guare do recommend a particular sort of strategy where basically you take the skills and you embed them in specific activities and you practice them in that context. Make sure you're setting small and achievable goals to kind of keep yourself motivated and reward yourself as you go. and then make sure you are telling people that you're working on that particular skill. That one kind of seems a little bit sound like, oh my God, I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's a huge motivator, and it actually is grounded in that sort of body doubling type science. And of course, this is what I do. You can work with an executive function coach for development of these skills. This is kind of what I do as an EF coach. Again, I work with teens and young adults in college as well as early in career in a one-on-one coaching setting, but I'm also developing some workshops. So that's kind of what I do. I'll have my contact information up later on as well. So specific activities, like I said, is kind of what we need to work on. Where do these activities come from? Well, for any activity, we have to kind of scope the work that we're going to do. We have to have a plan for it, and then we kind of deliver it. That's sort of how we think about work on a given day, right? And then we monitor ourselves, which I call regulation here, and we reflect on kind of what we achieved. And of course, that sometimes, and that serves as sort of the initiation of the next activity that we're going to do. Scoping, planning, delivering, monitoring ourselves, regulating, and then reflecting. That's sort of how we think about our day-to-day activities, not in the context of 12 skills. So what I did was I actually went ahead and mapped the 12 skills to actually how most people work. And so, I'll explore that with you over the next sort of, several minutes here. One other thing I want to mention is there are additional skills that are very critical to our progress on any given day. So whether you're a student or a young professional, there are skills that are related to how you learn. There are skills that are specific to your domain. So what I mean is, whether you're talking about household maintenance, car maintenance, welding, or you're talking about, well, being a coach, or you're talking about being a nurse, etc. There are skills that are specific to domains. These cognitive and domain skills are very critical, but of course they're outside our scope today. I just want to make sure that I wanted to make sure to mention them, so we're tracking the importance of them. In today's conversation, though, we'll focus on executive function skills. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into each of these work phases and kind of explore what it looks like to extract the specific activities and map specific executive function skills to them. Okay. So what are the activities that occur in scoping? Well, we have to understand the project and clarify the expectations around it. We have to understand the structure of what it is that we're working with. So for example, if you picked up, a sort of like a 30-page deck on cell structure, right? Just kind of knowing how the information is laid out and what are the different sort of categories inside this information that I'm about to consume and for the sake of what. Break down parts. So for example, if I asked you to, or if you were tasked to write a research paper, knowing what parts are, going to make sense, if you will, or how to kind of sequence that paper is going to make sense, and then identify the activities within those parts. So this is where working memory, planning, emotional control, and stress tolerance play a lot of role. And this is also the first sort of time you encounter those cognitive skills, just learning skills, if you will. At the scoping stage, what I found useful for students is just reading and writing support. So for example, visual organizers. So, and again, this is maybe less of an EF thing, much more of a cognitive thing, but either way, it is super helpful. And if you're coaching students and you're not cognizant of those sort of learning tools as well, you're probably missing the picture. Critical thinking and analytical sort of tools. So for example, idea mapping, causal flows, kind of sort of making sure that you work with the student to show what causes what other things to happen. Different notes-taking strategies are really important, and there's a lot of sort of supporting technology available for that. One of the things that, for example, that I've been exploring is Notebook LM. So there are students, for example, where reading it is great, but you're not going to retain that much of it. You prefer if somebody spoke about it or kind of told you, about that information. Notebook LM is really good at kind of taking things and turning them into a podcast, if you will. And that's something that I found that, at least some students find surprisingly very helpful. Okay, I'm going to show you an example of executive functioning skills development in context of scoping. So here's a student. They have enrolled in what we call Running Start in the Washington State system. It's a dual enrollment in community college. They're in high school. And what is happening is that a couple weeks in, they're struggling with just the amount of reading required for any given exam, any given class, or for writing papers. So literally in tears, right? So what we did was we worked together to create sort of almost like an approach that was very customized for the student on autism spectrum for how they should approach reading and reading at volume. So you'll notice that this, acronym SARNAR, for lack of better terms, is not something that you may find easily on the internet somewhere. Just like it's a very bespoke thing for this particular student. This is what I meant by that human in the loop, right? Because, for example, somebody could just tell them, oh, you should just scan the entire document for the structure of the document to get that big picture thinking up front. Right, except that this particular student's profile is they only think in concrete details. So you can keep sort of big picturing them and telling them to go to scan ahead and all that good stuff. That's simply a part of the puzzle, not the entire solution. The entire solution was something like this, where they read only very few things at a time, absorb them, reflect on just those few things, only take notes, very small, short sort of keywords only, right? And then move on until they're done with a particular section. When they're done with the section, they go back and then they annotate and underline and so on that entire section to further reinforce. And then when they're done with everything, they take a break and then go back and just kind of only take a look at their notes and reflect on it. Again, something very bespoke, and that's something that this particular student could internalize and say, yeah, that's mine, right? So that's sort of that's a great example of sort of working through executive functioning skills like working memory, emotional control, because again, we want you to read without tears, and be able to tolerate stress. Let's talk about planning a little bit. So planning is where we're determining the resources required, the amount of time that something is going to require. So you know kind of what activities you need to do from scoping. Well, how much work is each activity going to take? How much time it's going to take, right? What is too much detail to kind of track in your head is really not that important. In fact, you should kind of leave it somewhat flexible. Whereas, what are absolutely critical milestones that you should be committing to a master calendar, right? So that's kind of what planning looks like. So again, planning, organizational skills, time management skills, and that flexibility are really, really important in this planning phase. One of the things that I do with students, for example, is I'd have them do a master plan, then commit the milestones from that master plan in their main calendar. Yet on any given day, whether they do that on their whiteboard or on a notebook or in some kind of a tool, like an electronic task taker or something, whatever it is that works for you, I want you to jot down the three things you are going to get done that day and only work on those three things, preferably one at a time, right? So that's again where planning and some of these sort of tools kind of meet reality of what a given student's profile is. So let's take a look at an example here. So finals are coming up, crunch time is happening, right? The last 2 or 3 weeks, and this student is clearly struggling. They had a good plan, and they were even working through it fairly well. But when it's coming to the end of the quarter, because again they were at Bellevue College, so they moved to a quarter system by that time. Things move fast in a quarter system. Now you're juggling a lot of different things in those last couple of weeks, or last week. So one of the things that we did was, I worked with the student to kind of work, basically borrow from project management disciplines and kind of help them understand what a burn down plan looks like, which is used in product development actually, where you're literally estimating, the number of hours that a given person, so FTE hours, if you will, that it takes to kind of deliver one feature, right? And then just kind of creating a waterfall of the hours and know kind of which activity burns how much of those hours and check on it in a sunrise, sundown manner, what we call scrums in product development. That's literally what the student did. They basically project managed the heck out of those last couple of weeks. And they recalibrated as they went. I mean, one of the things they did on first day, which is really very precious, they wrote down every little detail possible. So 30 different activities, like this is all I'm going to need to do. And so this is again, one of the things you may be noticing here on the far, I guess, top right side is sort of this squiggly line up and down. This is me trying to explain to the student that, well, details can come and go. On any given task, you may be plus minus 15 minutes over or under, as long as those 6 hours for that day largely went to the three things that you had to get done that day. That's kind of what matters, right? So again, giving them that perspective. Delivery is where lots of skills are coming into motion. It's probably the most complex thing that we do because there's a planning aspect to it, there's a rescoping aspect to it, and then there's the doing aspect of it, while making sure that you're not snapping out of control and your emotions are not like, you're not having a meltdown and you're able to sustain your attention. So delivery is where, what really matters, I think, is this notion of what you bring from organization. is this notion of time and space, like having a designated time and space where you sit and kind of do your work, preferably. Time tracking becomes really important. So there are time tracking tools and templates that we can use, timers, multiple types of timers in multiple rooms if you need, a big clock and a small clock, et cetera, right? So those type of things. Scheduled check-ins are really important when it comes to delivery. So I love having an accountability buddy. I have a good friend of mine. I tell him that, hey, I've got this talk coming up at Art of KC. You got to keep me honest. Make sure that I actually get it done. Remember, task initiation is not my strong suite. Planning is. So this is again, a great way. Scheduled check-ins are a great way to make sure that you actually deliver on task. And this is where there are gamification apps available, for example, that'll let you kind of set rewards for yourself and kind of track your progress that you're actually delivering and completing the tasks that you're going to complete. Task completion is a classic sort of thing that matters in the delivery phase. Let me give you an example. Guess what this student struggles with? So, early in 2024, the student, their coach knows them well and says, you should start outlining your college essays like kind of early. Just start thinking about it, start outlining it. We want to make sure our students are doing independent work, right? So you give them more time to just kind of work through their struggle because that's what their profile is. And they sit on it and they try. And comes July, and what are they telling me? Hey, I have nothing to say. So, classic task initiation issue going on here, right? Smart student too. So once again, I don't want to do their work. And given my own strength is planning, what's my first reaction? My first reaction is, hey, we need a better plan. Part of it is because I want them to have better visibility into timelines, like how much does it take to get everything done, and how much each, like writing one page takes how much amount of time, and so on and so forth, right? So I do want to make sure that they, in fact, have better visibility into planning. But part of it is also, you learn, right? And I told you that I was going to be very transparent about things in this talk. Part of this is that the coach is also learning alongside you. I learned that my go-to skill may be planning, but for this student, I know I want them to work independently, but their deadlines are upon them. So something else needs to happen. So in this particular case, what we did was we leaned in heavily on that accountability buddy kind of a concept. So we scheduled time for several days at a given amount, at a given time in a given day, right? And basically said, okay, today we're not getting up, the first day of that sequence, today we're not getting up until we have 100 words on the page. The students struggled, emotion control was out of control, essentially. But eventually where they landed was they said, I cannot get words on the page. So when I probed on it, I said, well, why don't you just speak to it? Just say what you have to say, right? Don't worry about writing it. And I just sat there and students just spoke. And they spoke, and then they couldn't stop. Turned out that typing, just getting words on paper or on a keyboard, that was the block somehow. What that didn't mean was that they were short of ideas. They had ideas, right? So once they got going, I started to type for them, not their essay, but just like an outline. And before we knew it, we had our 200 words, right? Um, Not pretty, but something that this student can work with independently. So that's a classic sort of example of working through that task initiation by leaning on, sometimes outside help, right, to kind of get you through. Again, the student is great at planning. This is the same student when I told them to plan out, their several semesters, if you will, leading up to college entry. Look at how accountable they are holding themselves. They are tracking their SAT scores. I never asked them to do that. The SAT was actually optional, but they're great at planning, just not at task initiation, right? Okay. In that case study, the last one that we did, you kind of already saw a sense of regulation, right? So again, they're kind of working through their emotional, their frustration and so on and so forth. But regulation skills or regulatory skills, if you will, are kind of like a thing to themselves, I feel, and they are super important. They're very easy to kind of be relegated to that invisible category. So this is where, again, response inhibition, we talked about a little bit, emotion control, sustained attention, tolerating stress, and metacognition, all kind of like coming together. Practically, how do we see this happening? What we practically see is communication failures. That's typically what tells you that something is off with regulation. Snapping at your brother, snapping at your parents, disappearing into your room, like sort of social emotional distancing. I am just not good enough, right? And things like that, sort of unproductive or unconstructive sort of framing, catastrophizing everything, right? So things like that. That's what you experience or that's what you observe. Underneath the surface, what's going on is that these skills have kind of gone awry, right? Or something going on with those skills that you got to work on. So again, this is something that we can work with students on. It does take practice, but these are very specific skills, and you can work on these. My favorite is giving communication templates, and I will talk a little bit about it when I get into a case study with you guys. And then last but not the least, reflection. Again, one of my favorites is just kind of look back and kind of take a big picture. Metacognition is actually a strength of mine, so maybe that's why it speaks to me so well. But at the end of the day, this is sort of where we're kind of stepping back and seeing what did I learn this semester or this quarter. So in a quarter system, for example, for students who are in that kind of system, it really, really matters. What did I learn in this semester? What did I learn in this in the last sort of half of the semester in my ninth grade or 10th grade? Where am I in my overall process? And this is where checking in and having again like an accountability person really helps. I like encouraging planned experimentation in sort of that reflection stage. So what that really means is, well, you have a plan, but maybe you struggle with, well, what if this happens or what if that happens, and you tend to catastrophize things, and therefore now you are sort of impaired from taking any steps forward. What I like to do is I like to kind of say, okay, well, how about you try small steps in a given direction? And then we reflect on what we learned from that, right? They don't have to be big steps. So, for example, you want to be a YouTube influencer. I get this a lot, or Instagram influencer or whatever. Awesome, TikTok influencer. Well, why don't you post like a couple of videos and see how they go, right? See, get the look and feel of it. And sometimes they love it, and sometimes, one particular student was really interesting. When they worked through the process of posting videos at some frequency, they realized that it sucked. And actually, they weren't really into the process of it. They just liked what they saw, and what they saw they thought was everything. But the amount of work that actually goes into being or becoming an influencer was a lot. Another example I recently had was, a particular student who wants to be a day trader, doesn't want to go to college. The family is insisting that they go to college, of course. And so one of the things we did was I said, well, why don't listen, somewhere between giving him $10,000 or nothing for going to college or else, and giving him $500 to just kind of setting up with a small trading account, so he gets the feel for it. I think there is some productive middle space where we can land, and that's kind of what we did. We basically said, just start off with a small amount and get a look and feel for what trading feels like. The first day that loss hit, that was a good test of whether, the student really liked it or not. Now, it turns out they actually do like it. But, we'll have to see how that goes. Um, Here's an example of reflective planning. So what's happening in this case is that there's a student who's kind of kicking off their college application process. This student is actually really good at metacognition. Another thing that they're really good at is goal-oriented persistence, or goal persistence, goal-directed persistence, like so making sure they see things through the end, basically. So in this particular case, what their struggle was, am I going to get into my dream school despite gaps in my profile because I'm neurodivergent and I'm not like my neurotypical teens, whom particularly kind of in this area of state of Washington, they're all kind of taking all these highly rigorous courses and doing these activities, and I'm not. All right. So what we did was we co-developed a master plan. That's why, again, I'm showing you the sort of the ugly whiteboard here, because that's sometimes what it takes, right? Just kind of like writing things down together and not worrying about the perfection, but just kind of working through the process of developing a plan. And that's kind of what we did. So we reflected upon, well, what do you mean by dream school? What is it that you really want to do? Why do you think you want to do that? Working backward from there, well, what kind of activities and courses therefore you need to take? How do they kind of like lay out over the course of a couple of years, right? And so on and so forth. So this was sort of a classic example of reflective planning. We did that over multiple days. But this, mind you, that this is not a plan that you can immediately put into action. You have to kind of go a level deeper and create specific plans for specific sort of courses and activities after that. But having that sort of big roadmap was a classic example of reflection, much more so than even planning, right? So to kind of bring it all back together, you can kind of break down activities in your daily life in sort of along a natural rhythm of your work, and then map different sort of skills to them, which makes it far easier to kind of address those executive function skills. And as you work through these skills, what goes on inside is that you're developing what, in the science, in what scientists like to call sort of this neuroplasticity or cognitive flexibility. You're learning how to regulate yourself and inhibit sort of these unhelpful impulses. And so you start to kind of select the best behaviors that you need to kind of lean in on to lead to the outcomes that you desire. Over the course of time, that serves to motivate you. And of course, that's kind of what helps you eventually set purpose. I want to be a physical therapist. And meaning, I want to be a physical therapist because I don't like seeing people in pain. Right. So that's what starts off as an EF skills journey, if you will, ends up with meaning and purpose in the following manner. Um, the what when How will you know that your student is in fact on that arc? You'll start to see emerging signs throughout the process. So, for example, again, the student that I was talking about earlier with the master plan, we start to kind of see in sophomore year even that they were starting to kind of show signs of emerging independence. Like this student in this particular email, they're reaching out themselves to their academic advisor by this time and kind of saying, hey, listen, I want to make sure that I'm on track, things like that. The student was very serious and committed to their executive function skills development. They were nominated several times actually as a student of the quarter, went on to win student of the quarter in the third quarter of their sophomore year. And then, of course, after that, went on to further challenge themselves because they were very motivated and decided to go to Running Start and then eventually graduated from high school with a cum laude GPA. So I would say that that's a great journey in terms of like what concerted effort on executive functioning can look like. Okay, I'm about to go into two sort of end-to-end case studies, which kind of bring all these skills together. So case study number one. So again, high school student, early college dual enrolled, autism spectrum, ADD. They're what I guess would be called a twice exceptional profile in the sense that they have a slow processing speed, but they do have good IQ and so on. So let's start with scoping, right? So start of the work, if you will. So this student decided that one of the activities in their college master plan was to write a research paper. And not just a research paper in their high school classes or whatever, but like an actual research paper that looks very academic. So they decided to enroll in a program called Polygence to, craft an academic-looking research paper, if you will. So their task at hand was how to select and structure their topic. So this is where, what I did was I worked with the student to basically develop a framework that is suited for a paper on medical conditions. This is kind of what they wanted to do. I want to write about medical conditions. So, again, the idea was to kind of like give them framework for how to think about medical conditions. Well, what are the different parts of a medical condition? When something causes it, well, then you have to do something about it. So you have to treat it, if you will. Well, you have to find it, so you have to diagnose it. Then you have to treat it and preferably prevent it from, for others from having it, if you will. So I said, well, what about you work with that kind of a structure? And then again, they kind of went on from it and kind of kept developing sort of the subsections around it and so on. What does the plan look like for delivering a research paper? Now, Polygence gave them milestones, so that was good, right? So the organization that they were part of, they gave them milestones to hit, if you will. But the idea was that, well, at a more detailed day-to-day level, how do we make that sort of, time visible? Like, what takes 30 minutes, what takes 2 hours, what you're thinking is going to take 15 minutes, but it's actually like a 3-day long activity because you're way underestimating the effort on it, etc. So this is where, again, one of the things I did was I also kind of invoked AI for this. And I said, hey, listen, let's ask Copilot to kind of create a project plan for us for an academic research paper and estimate the effort for you. And then you can work with it and see whether it's realistic for what you're trying to get done and so on. Spot the gaps and so on. So skills targeted here are, of course, planning and prioritization, being organized, and time management. Now, this student, super committed, they decided that they wanted to kind of create a draft check-in, create a draft check-in, create a draft check-in on a very regular schedule. They worked through 5 drafts between March and August of 2024 and checked in regularly with the coach as well as their Polygence mentor. Um, the Toward the finish line, the same thing happened that I mentioned earlier in an earlier example, the crunch time right before finals. So near the finish line, despite all their coordinated effort and so on and so forth, they realized that there's just way too many steps and things to kind of keep track of. So, this is again what really mattered was just kind of sitting down and creating like a burn down plan, making sure expectations were clear. So, for example, Polygon said, "Hey, you can join our symposium," and so the students are really excited. I asked them, "Well, what do you think that means?" They have no clue, right? So they go back and kind of like probe on the fact that what does it mean to be, delivering a presentation to a symposium, etc. So again, we kind of did this sort of sunrise, sundown check-in. They worked through that, planning and prioritization, being flexible, sustaining their attention, leaning in on their sort of that goal-driven, persistence. Um, by the number of exclamation marks, I'm gonna go ahead and guess that the student was very excited about the fact that they got to their finish line. Huge confidence boost, right? Huge sort of boost to their sort of self-image and so on and so forth. They're like reminding and sending, us emails about like, how many places that their paper is going to get and how many formats that they're published in, and so on. So, second case study. This student is ADD, also has a generalized anxiety disorder, also twice exceptional. Um, This student was this classic profile that I think I mentioned earlier when we started this presentation, that, the semester starts, everything looks okay, we're fine, and then things start to fall apart. First sort of the snapping at your brother, snapping at your parents starts, then the disappearing into your room starts, and then eventually somebody needs to step in and help you create a rescue plan, which indeed is what I did in this case. So the red box kind of shows where the student was. And basically, one of the things that I did with the student that I've found to be very helpful is, and by the way, parents may not agree amongst themselves sometimes on this approach. They may just say turn everything into an A, right? Or turn everything into a B. I get this a lot. What I said was, I don't care about your grades. What I want you to do is agree on some principles first, right? Because the principles are going to help you develop a process. The process is going to deliver the grades. Just saying you want certain grades is not going to deliver the grades. So we agreed on some principles. So for example, principle number 1, don't make everything perfect. Focus on just completing and submitting. So done is better than, perfect, right? The other thing was this student thought that, a great way of making progress was, hey, you said small goals, small achievable goals. My grade on the paper where I'm getting on biology, where I've been getting an F, has gone from 48% to 49.5%. Real conversation, by the way. And I said, yeah, well, that's not exactly progress. So you do have to aim high. And I said, well, maybe you aim as high as you can, but going from F to D is a very small increment, and you could just as easily fall short. So something better, right? That type of thing. So again, daily check-in with your teacher, your parents, coach, etc. No other computer time allowed, things like that. Look, they didn't finish with A's, but they finished decently. There is no F, right? And so I would say different students are different. I showed you the example of one student earlier, who sort of graduates cum laude. This student makes some realistic progress, and I think that is commendable. Different strokes for different folks, and a lot of times, more so than students, I think families need to kind of contend with that and make peace with it. Also, it takes everybody sometimes to kind of deliver on these goals. So in this case, parents are leaning in, like, they're kind of like trying to support the student and reaching out to advisors. And what I'm really doing here is actually modeling outreach. I don't want to do this, but the student doesn't know how to do this either. So I'm just kind of templatizing for them what it looks like to take ownership. They're not going to write 2-paragraph emails anytime soon. That's kind of where they were at that time. They were not in a position to be able to write these kind of emails at that time, but the job was to model it for them, give them these templates and so on. And what I found was that the school system, the teachers lean in when they see that the student is starting to lean in and the family is checked in, and they haven't just kind of, you know, um, set the student on cruise control. Um, so in this case, eventually the student starts to believe in themselves and they start to write emails like this on their own, where they're reaching out to the professor and saying, "Hey, man, I came to your flex time today to take this test, but you know the sub teacher didn't have the test available." Or, "Hey, I was marked absent, but I wasn't absent, and I can prove it." Again, when you notice self-advocacy start to kind of take root in your student, do take notice and commend them. Give them like, yay, thumbs up, etc. Because it does take a lot of effort for them. And teachers and well-wishers and coaches, they notice, right? And they'll write back and they'll say, yeah, hey, listen, you are showing me. And as parents, one of the things that I would also say is that do trust, but also verify that your student and your teachers and their teachers are on the same page. Um, all of that progress, you give 6 months later, the next academic year starts, summer regression happens, and all that good stuff. It is common. And they may be back where they started, like by October. And once again, they're struggling and so on. And, parents are leaning in, or coaches are leaning in. Another thing I found is that teachers and will sometimes have a different estimation of where the student is compared to you as a family. So in this case, the teacher is saying, "Oh, but the student is totally fine. In fact, they've had the most engaging dialogue with me ever." Wonderful, but that's not how you're grading them. You're grading them on a paper. I'm just saying, either say that you're going to grade them on a dialogue or help them write a paper, right? So in this case, again, you have to kind of like really lean in and understand the detail around where your student is really falling apart and what are the skills that you really need them to be supported with. By the way, this notion of having a great dialogue but not writing a paper reminds you of another case example that I gave you earlier, where the student was saying, "I can't write it, but and ultimately I got them going and they were able to speak to it." So again, this is a classic scenario. A quick sidebar is where I feel our school system also needs to evolve, and the way our neurodivergent students can demonstrate their skills needs to, there need to be more variety there. Habit formation takes time, and despite the hiccups, like I just showed you, over a long enough trajectory, if you're seeing that the student is becoming more and more sort of, or sort of like, incorporating the skill more and more, in this case, self-advocacy, more and more into their life, you have to celebrate that, right? So, like, for example, in this particular case, by 2023, so by the end of 2023, so where did they start? I can't get anything done, where are they landing eventually? They're advocating for the fact, and in short, crisp, clear, and respectful emails to their teachers, where, for example, they're marked absent but they shouldn't have been, etc. So, with that said, we are now at our wrap up. So look, I mean, as a coach, I'd like to think that I work on skills that are highly relevant for my students. I'm kind of a practical guy. I come from industry and not necessarily from a teaching environment. And both are good, but I do believe that one of the things that industry backgrounds do is that they do equip you to kind of lean in more with your student in terms of what are employers really looking for. And eventually, a lot of parents, that's kind of what they really want for their kid. Is he or she going to make it? They're going to be able to have a job and hold it down and so on. I'm fairly involved in the higher ed space, so one of the things I like to do is I like to keep my approaches sort of up to scale or up to market in terms of whatever's the latest thinking. And what you'll always get from me is what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, in a respectful, values-aligned space. You do need to bring two things, though. Whether you work with a coach or not, you do need to bring two things, and only you can bring them. One is your commitment. No one can help if you don't want to be helped, but the right people will take you very far if you are committed to the process. And it is a process and it takes some time. Which brings me to the second ingredient, which is alignment. And this is perhaps more an advice to the families than even the students. Like I said, it is a journey and this journey takes time. So one of the things that I always advise families on is that if you're sitting here and your student is saying he doesn't want to go to college, he wants to do this day trading thing, or at best try out community college for a couple of years while day trading, and you're saying, no, thou shalt go to Rutgers and then thou shalt go to graduate school because that's what you got to do. And after that, you can do whatever day trading all you want. you've just given this ADD student a 6-year roadmap. Um, 15 minutes is hard for them to, sort of visualize. And you're telling them a 6-year roadmap. Do you know how frustrating that might be? Right. So I think one of the things, therefore, I always kind of remind families on is get on the same page. Right. And again, coaches can help you with creating a profile for yourself in terms of where you are and where you probably can be and where you want to be. And hopefully they're going to be very objective and they're going to, again, tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. At the end of the day, only you can solve this problem. And again, likewise for students, get on the same page. Make sure that your parents and your family wish you well. So listen to them. What are they telling you? Maybe you are being unrealistic about day trading and so on. So commitment and alignment. I think those are two key ingredients and only you can bring them. Nobody else can do that for you. If you bring them, the journey is beautiful. It does take effort, but you will make progress toward whatever picture of yourself that you imagine. Last couple of things. You went from middle school into high school. Everything seems very exciting, maybe even somewhat anxiety provoking. By the end of 10th grade, you'll be far over that horizon. Why do I bring this up? I say start early. That's why I bring this up. You have to start on this journey for executive function skills development early, early, early. Of course, we can still help, and EF skills are one of those things that even when you're in college or even at a workplace, you can continue to work on them. What I'm saying is be proactive, not reactive. That you'll make much more progress that way. And if you're in the summer and you're wondering what you want to do, I would say work on practicing a few skills. I will leave you with this formula where the idea is to kind of map one of these 12 skills that we talked about to a particular activity, and then ask yourself that for this activity within some set duration, you're going to work on delivering a particular outcome. Right now, you're at some baseline and you're going to raise it in small increments to your goal. Along the way, take frequent stops, reward yourself. One great book is Atomic Habits, for example, where James Clear talks about making 1% improvement every day because it really compounds by the end of the year. On any given day, it may feel like I'm not really making much progress, but you are. Wait till the end of the year. Again, long-term commitment kind of matters. And this is why it helps to kind of work with someone and just kind of track your progress on a frequent basis. So with that said, we've come to the end of our conversation.
So, Kashyap, there's a question in the chat. Alicia asked, I was wondering if there are any note-taking apps you would recommend to support the student's own notes.
Yeah, so one of the things that Seattle U actually uses, I actually did not know about this one. It's called Genio. So this is, has anybody heard of this? So we were actually just at the Disability Services Office earlier this week, I want to say. My weeks are all sort of crashing. And they have actually, they do allow the use of Genio in class. There are a couple of other startups, and one of the things that they do is let you kind of, where basically the app is listening to the lecture, it's collecting, and it's kind of taking notes for you. Genio seems a little more mature. It's also slightly older technology though, so there are trade-offs for everything.
I had a question for you. You had mentioned that like the person coming to you or coming to an executive functioning coach, what they really need to bring is their own commitment. I wonder what you would say to parents who say that's the part they're struggling with.
Like to commit to something?
Getting like a lot of, I found when my son was this age, I sometimes felt like I cared more than he did.
Yeah.
And trying, saying to him, all we need is your commitment. Like that was the hard part, was getting him to be like all in and willing to work hard because it was hard for him.
Yeah, no, that is a double-edged sword. So one is the symptom of commitment, and then there's commitment itself. So I should be clearer about this, and thank you for this feedback. I will be clearer about this in future sort of sessions as well of this talk. Of course, when parents sometimes engage coaches, the struggle is the very fact that this kid, they're in their room all day and all they're doing is gaming and et cetera and so forth. So they don't seem very committed. When coaches sit down with the student, because let's face it, a lot of times we are being approached in a reactive mode, not in a proactive mode, which is why I try to actually remind people, please be proactive. But at the end of the day, what do you do with that student? I don't know whether they're committed yet. All they've done is they've demonstrated a particular behavior to their parents. They haven't
Mm,
demonstrated that to me yet. What I actually mean is when you get started with me, for example, right? So our process is that you're going to go through an initial intake, fairly detailed, right? Where we'll find out more about you and the family will lean in. We'll have a family session. So it takes like an hour and a half. I'll write a report and create a learning plan. The learning plan is going to have these sort of activities with goals and so on and so forth. And then we're going to get started in the actual coaching sessions. If we're 3 sessions in, right, I kind of use that as an earmark, and either you and I are not connecting, right, or I just noticed that there's just a resistance to want to try. So, for example, think about the example I gave of the student who said she couldn't write anything on the paper. But
mm,
then when we got her going, she was, and she had wonderful ideas, right? So it is so interesting, right? That
mm,
to me is a student who was not committed at the intake, but it's a matter of connecting with them and finding them where they
mm.
are. And then they were committed,
Right. Okay.
right?
So
By the
even
way,
their willingness to show up, I would think to some degree is a sign of low level commitment. You can't make a
exactly,
teenager do things they don't want to do.
exactly. In fact, one of the things I love that you said low level commitment. 'Cause one of the things that we do, particularly in the executive function domain, is these sort of low level buy-ins, right? So like small buy-ins. Okay, listen. So as you can imagine, one of the things that I get a lot is IDK, right? I don't know. It's like, well,
Hmm.
what do you want to work on today? Well, I don't know,
Hmm.
right? So how do you get past that? And so, or, well, listen, you're missing 18 assignments. Which one?
Pick any of them.
Right? Which one should we work on today? Right? I don't know. Right? Okay, well, let's pick one. Right? Are you willing to pick one? Right? So let's pick the first one. We'll just pick it randomly.
Mhm.
I mean, these are real examples, right? And so
Oh,
you
I
just
know.
pick.
I'm getting triggered just hearing this. My son's 24 and I'm still like, yes, I've had these conversations.
So and, it's like it's hard to argue with let's pick one randomly. So,
Right.
but if you keep getting I don't know or I don't want to do that either, right? So
Mhm.
that's when I think what coaches need to do. And again, this is why I so emphasize this notion of authenticity as a coach, right? The coach has to work with the family and say, hey, listen, I can keep moving to session number 6. And, then we're going to have a very difficult conversation where you're going to say no goals have been met. But to your point, though, at intake, the student may look very uncommitted, but it's a matter of
Yeah.
connecting with them and seeing whether they show up. Are they willing to try new things? A lot
Mhm.
of times, I'm sorry to just kind of keep going on this topic, but one of the things that I found also is a lot of times it's this notion of self-image where they've got the self-perception that I just suck at all of this.
Mhm.
And you have to kind of like peel that onion back one layer at a time and say, well, you suck at everything.
Right. Right.
You think that's rational? Right?
And
So,
I think I mean, I've shared with you also, my son that's now 24 is a college graduate with a full-time job and he's doing great. And it like his executive functioning skills have really come a long way from when he was a teenager who kept saying, I don't know, and no, I don't have anything to do or whatever. So there's a lot of reason for hope.
absolutely. And isn't that worth celebrating, right? I mean, and so
Yeah.
this is I love hearing that, Rachel, every time, right? So this is phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I, he really struggled with these skills as a younger person. So Kashit, this has been so great. Amazing. Wonderful presentation and great conversation at the end. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Happy to do this anytime. Maybe we'll do a redo if people find the YouTube
Hmm.
and that suffices. That's wonderful. Happy to kind of come back and do this again as well, bring more case studies to it, or speak to them
Yeah, and I
differently,
have a
etc.
feeling once school picks up again, once the school year
Yeah.
starts, this will be an issue that's on a lot of people's minds.
Well, thank you guys so much for your time. Jay, thank you so much for being a generous host. Rachel, thank you for your time. Alicia, thank you so much for coming in and your engaging questions. And so, if you're seeing this presentation and you have feedback for me, do reach out. I will actually welcome it. Feedback is a gift. So
Wonderful. Well, have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the beautiful summer weather. And thank you so much again, Kashyap. And thanks, Jay.
thank you guys. Have a great
Bye,
weekend.
everyone.